With ministry, I know like there's different seasons of life in ministry. Like you have good seasons, bad seasons. I'd love to hear kind of what season you were in that kind of led you to writing this book, because a lot of this book it seems about kind of slowing down,
Yeah, yeah.
and not being in hurry. Which I know it's kind of like this oxymoron where following Jesus is, Jesus walked everywhere, but a lot of times serving in church can be this busy,
Yeah.
busy, busy. So I'd love to hear what that season was like, kind of leading you to writing this book.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Jesus walked everywhere because a year ago, like literally right at a year ago, I was in the Holy Land doing a 100-mile hike, and we walked the footsteps of Jesus. Like we walked around the Sea of Galilee, and we just walked where he walked, and it was 100 miles over the course of a week. And one of the things that hit me on that trip was how much time he spent outside walking with people that he shared life with. And that is a lot of time, So in the Gospels, you read these narratives where he's in this village and now he's in the next village, and it felt like he hopped in the car and drove over there. But it was a half a day's hike, and it really was convicting to me about the pace in which he lived and how he connected with people, walking from village to village, walking along the way. In fact, that phrase "along the way" is a really common phrase in the Gospels to describe the life
Yeah.
of Jesus. It's along the way, and so that's in stark contrast, oftentimes, to the way we live, and certainly in the stark contrast to the way that I found myself living at a certain speed and pattern. I would say around 2019, I became senior pastor at this church, and that transition um, ushered in a season that was really busy for me, but I knew it was temporary. I remember saying to my wife, "Hey, I'm sure the first year or so is going to be a little crazy, but um, we'll adjust." But about however many months, 6, 8 months into it, COVID hit, and then it just got busier and busier, and I just kept thinking, "Hey, it's okay. We'll get to a place that things normalize." But I like to think of it as like, if you run a sprint and it turns out to be a marathon, you're in trouble, right? Like, if you think it's only going to last a few weeks or a few months or whatever, you're fine. But then when it's a few years, things start to catch up to you. And so I was in a position as a pastor where I had worked with lots of people who had violated God's rhythms for their lives over the years, had kind of experienced the pain of doing things their way instead of his. And as a result of that, I was able to see some of these same things were evident in my life. And so in the book, I talk about these 4 emotions that surface when we're not abiding, when we're not staying connected to Jesus, when we're kind of doing things our way. And the 4 emotions I highlight in the book are common, but when they come all together and they don't go away is what I'm talking about. One is discouragement. It's where you live with this lack of courage or enthusiasm. It's normal for a few minutes, any part of any day, to feel that way. But when that is how you feel for a long period of time, that's not good. That starts to not only cause you trouble, but cause trouble to the people around you. Just living with this lack of courage or confidence. Second thing is anxiety, where you feel overwhelmed by things in your life you can't control, things you can't change. Third thing is frustration, where you're more irritable. Frustration or anger is it spreads. So if you feel it a little bit over here, your way's not working over here at work, or you're violating God's way over here at work, then it just it transfers onto your other relationships, family. And then the last thing is just being tired, fatigue, worn out. Again, that's normal enough, but when you're constantly living that way, when you're just always tired, that's an indication that you're violating these rhythms that God has made for you to live with.
Yeah. And it's really interesting you bring up those 4 emotions, because I feel like right now, like more than ever, you're able to see those emotions in people, or those emotions that people are wrestling with through like social media. Like, especially like if
Yeah.
you get on Twitter, and I try to stay off of Twitter, but anywhere, like you see just like never before all these emotions that most people are dealing with. Like it in a sad way, it just seems like the American way, this busy American way has just created this like insufferable experience of being a human. Whereas
Yeah.
what you write about calls to like the opposite of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's coincidence, right? Like
Yeah.
if you look culturally around at, uh, let's take frustration as an example. Like this tendency for people these days to be easily offended or to be very sensitive or constantly irritated isn't right. And so when you recognize that on a large scale in our Western world, that's an indication that we're as a whole, we're not living the way that God designed us to live. I see this sometimes when I go to a different country and I see the pace that they live, a much more simple life perhaps, and you look at it and you think, well, that's not the way I would want to live. And yet they don't feel discouraged or anxious or depressed on the same levels that we do. And so yeah, those emotions were consistent in my life. Some of those were, but to your point, I recognize those on a larger scale in the church where I get to serve. Just recognize that, man, this is something that seems like people are dealing with on a larger scale than I've seen.